Death wields an arrow. What do I mean by that? Here you see a collection of deadly implements, but the one being held by Death himself is an arrow. Or a feathered spear as well, which is a specific kind of mostly forgotten weapon that I'll talk about coming up. But the bottom line is arrows, darts, javelins. I had to pick one word for my video title. And anyway, I look at a lot of old texts, old scanned texts, as part of my research, and it's always stood out to me that Death holding a dart of some kind used to be as, if not more common, than him holding a scythe. So I want to show you some of the many wicked images that play off of that theme. It's just a great little piece of iconography, as well as art and, I guess you could say, weapons history. This guy here is from 1756, and from a work called The English Dance of Death. We'll talk about the Dance of Death, but first, here's the, to us, classic representation of death in the Western tradition, the Grim Reaper. Well, a scythe is as outdated an implement as an arrow, and for some reason the Reaper survived, but this here did not. I love the variations in the depictions of death. There's going to be a lot of variety in here, but here you see kind of the classic long arrow. It's really more of a feathered spear or fletched javelin, like I said, but he's holding the heart of his latest victim and has hair, kind of. If you saw that, just like this guy here. Now, this one obviously wields a bow and arrow, so it's literally Death wielding an arrow. I love the detail on the quiver. There's a lot going on here, including the precursor to the tarot's Wheel of Fortune on the left, but we can see bow and arrow equipped skeletal figure about to let loose an arrow. Really love this one. The coffin's a cool addition. Definitely a fletched javelin, but I love the skull looking at the skull, and if you noticed his hollowed out cavity in the abdomen, you'll see that artistic device quite a bit. Here's the death card on the earliest surviving version of tarot. There's that cavity we just talked about, and he's got an elaborate bow. So we're seeing already how much of a go-to this was in comparison to what we talked about before, the Grim Reaper surviving with his scythe. And yes, this is from one of the Bill and Ted movies. I was happy to have an excuse to do that. So this made it, right? It still sticks around to this very day. I love this kind of vintage comic book, but to this very day it's around, but it's just as obsolete, like I said, as the arrow or javelin. What's going to surprise you, I think, is that they seem to have once been a pair. Let's go to medieval manuscript type illustrations now, and this guy is well armed with multiple scythes and fletched javelins, so looks like he has a lot of work ahead of him. Stunning image, and real quick, the fletched javelin, historically, it's basically a spear that has more control, right, because of the feathers, because of the fletching. I should probably do a separate video on those at some point, so here again, the combination. Pretty neat, not even something that I could only find once. And here we go yet again. So, seems to me the Grim Reaper, as we think of him, lost the arrows and the javelins at some point. Who knew? And here's one more along those lines. I love how Death is checking himself out in the mirror. And real quick, it's worth noting how he shows that he doesn't have to handle only one of the two types of instruments we've covered. And now here he is with just the one tool that we're concerned with today, in an image that's obviously very similar to some of the ones we just surveyed, as we stick to roughly the medieval period, and we're still there with this muscled up and fleshed out Death. Looks like he fired one arrow, is about to fire another one, and I really like this one because he looks like something from a Tim Burton movie. Also, like Santa Claus, we can see that he has a list, so I'm sure he's been checking it twice. Might do a different video one day on all the different combinations of items Death wields and uses. Real quick, here's a historical image showing the exact kind of weapon we're talking about. So that really does feel like a favorite implement put in Death's hands. Kind of surprising considering it's more of a specialized weapon, I think. Certainly more so than spears or arrows that were used a lot more generally. Love this image. Very bizarre. Note the exaggerated fletching, and is he carrying a coffin? Maybe. But back to how much more common the bow and arrow, for instance, was. Here's a divine figure that shoots mortals with a bow and arrow. Cupid, of course. Or a small group of cherub cupids, and the best detail here, this painting, by the way, is by Raphael. Best details in the upper left, where you've got the one that's holding the extra ammo. So that's just one example of how it just makes intuitive sense, maybe, to have a figure like Death using an arrow or a missile of some kind. But here's a really interesting twist on that. Death as a centaur/archer. What a killer image, pun intended, I guess. And this is actually a fairly modern one. Victorian era that looks older. Here is an ancient image, and it's of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Death is here in the foreground, and he has a pitchfork, so just kind of reinforcing the point that, the figure of death historically has been depicted with different instruments. Here he is, but wielding his scythe. See that at the upper right? Now let's briefly touch on the Dance of Death that I mentioned before. This was an artistic convention that became big after the Black Death. There was just so much death going around with the bubonic plague that dying not only became a more common subject in art, but death became a more common character. The bottom line here was, it doesn't matter who you are going to die. And you can see death kind of jauntily taking one person after another to meet their maker. What's most interesting about it to me is that although on the surface it's this orthodox religious teaching, hey, you better be good because you're going to die and then you'll go to heaven or hell, depending on how you lived, there's this obvious kind of gallows humor aspect to it, right? Like, why is he just dancing so merrily as he kills people? There's also an egalitarian note, kind of this, well, I may not be a pope or a king, but they're going to die just like me. And that tradition actually combines with the kind of thing we're focusing on here. I love this one. This is from a book of hours in Spain. He has almost an alien look, and you can see that he's hit his mark. But you'll see some of our images have this kind of a death figure, but they'll be titled Dance of Death. And that just doesn't make surface level sense unless you know the backstory, right? Meaning, why would Dance of Death be a title on a work with death as an archer, and he's not dancing? The other tradition that wraps into all this is the triumph of death. Petrarch in 1351, Petrarch is called the father of humanism, wrote his triumph poems, Triumphi, and he had, the triumph of death, the triumph of love, so on. And that spurred countless visual interpretations by artists like this. And the main point was very similar to the Dance of Death. The Reaper gets everybody in the end. And that's why he's kind of standing triumphantly. So whenever you see this kind of image, Renaissance or later, it usually goes back to this. And that's why you'll see our archer, spear thrower, javelin throwing death, sometimes in the same arrangement, like here. And notice one of the other allegorical figures actually holds the scythe there, by the way. Now we jump way ahead in time to show that this version of the Reaper, he's not technically a Reaper because he's not reaping, right? He's not cutting down, but I'm going to use the term because it's still kind of the overall handle. Anyway, to show that he made it into modernity. This one here is called the Bad Man at the Hour of Death, so we have the ancient warning, and with that exact ancient figure, although he looks real sinewy and alien-y here. Here's a Georgian-era cartoon. It's a satirical one, but we've got our skeleton with the arrow, hourglass in his other hand. Here the undertakers are rushing up for the opportunity to make some money, because that guy's about to die. A lot of our modern images are from England, by the way. Entitled The Last Drop, this woman doesn't know she's enjoying the last taste of her lavish lifestyle. Notice how this is definitely just an arrow that Death is holding. I think these modern artists might not have known what a fletched javelin was, and that's why this guy from 1827 has a simple spear. Often the length, sometimes the feathers got forgotten. Here's a really fantastic allegorical scene. I'd like to explore it in depth, but I won't here. Let's just take note of how great our killer looks on the right. He's one of those more fleshed out versions that we've seen, right? Not just bones. More of just a portrait this time. Notice the hourglass, which we've seen in a lot of these works, and the symbolism there is pretty obvious, right? Your time is up. In the four corners of this work, a frontispiece of a book called The British Dance of Death, as opposed to the English Dance of Death, which gave our video its opening image. We have the skeleton mercilessly doing his job, and then in the center of it, he has the scythe, so that's an interesting combination. Also, you see the crown there, we've seen that before, the crown and the globe symbolize him being the actual king of the world. Here we're going to just rifle through some of the pages from that book, and just like with the Dance of Death, the point is that no one is spared. Not even this doctor who doesn't realize he's the one that's in real danger. I'm going to break the timeline I've mostly been sticking to now to show some of my absolute favorites as we wrap up. This is by Hieronymus Bosch, yes, the painter, the master from The Garden of Earthly Delights, and this is The Death and the Miser from the late 15th century. There's a lot going on here, which I guess is something he excelled at as a painter, but especially loved the representation of death on the left and the little demons or monsters scattered throughout the painting. This one here looks fantastic, and it ties together a lot of what we've been talking about, right? The related traditions. So the verses said, "My arrow, I promise you, spares no one. You will all dance the ballet of which I sing." So we have the novelty of the crossbow, of course, and just exquisite art, but also it specifically mentions the dance, and that doesn't quite make sense, like I said earlier, but that proves how interrelated all of these things were. This was from about 100 years after the last piece, by the way, and now a sculpture. This is Death Triumphant from about 1670, so prepare to be blown away. This isn't the only sculpture of this type either. If you Google image search this one, you'll get some related pieces, so really neat. This is German, probably from Bavaria. And let's jump back to the Middle Ages one more time, because I like how he's mounted on a beast of some indeterminate type. But we're really here for one final visual reminder. Death doesn't just swing a scythe, he wields an arrow. Thanks.